I have said before that I don't want to get into the habit of talking about current events too much. I really don't want this to be that kind of a channel. But man, between coronavirus and this, it's really hard not to. So, let's talk about this. We're going to talk about George Floyd. We're going to talk about protests. We're going to talk about President Trump. And we're going to talk about communication and how we communicate and talk with one another as a society. Let's talk about the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officer Derek Chauvin, who was acting in his capacity as a police officer at the time the murder was committed. As you all know by now, there's a video of Derek Chauvin doing this. He kneels on George Floyd's neck in an 8-minute video for roughly that entire time. George Floyd saying he's going to die. Nearby bystanders taking the video, saying they're concerned about his life, asking the police officer to stop, saying one of my homies died like this. George Floyd replying, yes, I'm going to, as well. Once Floyd passes out, one of them says, he's unresponsive. Can you get off of him? And the police officer continues to kneel there. And the man dies. And it's clearly what anyone would call murder. Take the standard you would apply to a normal person doing the same thing and apply it to this police officer. Yeah, if someone who's not a police officer did it, we would say that's absolutely murder. Same standard applies. There's no reason in this case, or in most cases, or in any case, to apply entirely different standards to people just because they're acting in the capacity of the office that they're in, right? We wouldn't accept it from people in Nazi Germany saying, oh, well, I was just following orders. I was acting in my capacities as an officer of the state. So when someone does something that would qualify as murder, and obviously it's not as horrendous as what the Nazis did, but it's still pretty horrendous to kill someone in cold blood that way with people standing by asking you not to, his status as a police officer shouldn't serve as any sort of a shield. And luckily in this case, I'm hoping that it doesn't. He's been arrested, he's been charged with murder, and we can all cross our fingers in hopes that justice is served in this particular case. Although, let's go a step further and talk about the other 3 police officers who were there who did nothing and didn't get involved. If they hadn't been police officers, they most likely would have been arrested at this point in time too. Had they just been a part of a roving gang, they would have been accessories. So if we're going to apply justice consistently, it seems as though something ought to be done there, but that's neither here nor there for the purpose of this video. Now that we have the facts of the George Floyd case established, let's talk really quickly about the facts of the protests and the riots that are going on. Now these started off the way most of these do, as being pretty peaceful, more or less, but then things escalated. You have videos online now of protesters attacking shops and people in the shops and people fighting back. You have videos of violence on the part of protesters against other protesters, on the part of protesters against people attempting to defend where they live. However, those sorts of videos are largely outnumbered of videos of cops, police officers, behaving extremely inappropriately. You have videos of police officers sticking a can of pepper spray out of a window as they drive by a crowd of peaceful protesters, and they just hold the pepper spray out the window and spray it. You have police officers walking down the streets in Minneapolis with paint guns, shooting people just peacefully standing on their front porches for no reason. You have videos of just police officers going up to people who are clearly peacefully protesting and assaulting them out of the blue. You have the videos of the police officers attacking the old man with the cane on the street and knocking him over, right? So you have all sorts of violence that has now come about as a part of these protests. All right, those are the facts. We've roughly gone over what has happened and what most people agree has happened. I have a quick bone to pick with both conservatives and with liberals about how they communicate about things before we talk about what should actually be done in this particular case and solutions. So I'm going to start off with conservatives. I have a bone to pick with you guys. You all agree that what happened in this case was murder and that it was bad. And you probably agree that it shouldn't ever happen again. And you probably agree that it has happened in the past more often than it should have. Right? I think everyone agrees on this. I don't think this is particularly controversial. Now, what may be controversial, if you're a conservative, is whether or not the protests are justified, whether or not the riots and looting are justified. It may be controversial to you whether this happens more frequently to African Americans than to white people. Right? You may try to cite statistics that seem to suggest that that they're both harmed in the same proportion. Right? There's a lot of things you may gripe with about the traditional narrative, but what we all agree on is that this shouldn't have happened. We hope it doesn't happen again, and it's happened too often in the past. All right. What are we going to do about that to make that less likely? Do we have any concrete policy solutions or steps we could take? It seems to me, and we'll talk about these later, that there are quite a few that we could take that would be pretty helpful and that would work pretty darn well. But no one seems to be suggesting taking them, particularly not people on the right. People on the right instead tend to be giving those arguments I gave a second ago about why, even though this was a bad thing, the riots and protests aren't justified because of the violence that's happening under them on the part of the rioters. They barely ever mention the violence, unjustified violence against peaceful protesters on the part of police. But they would be opposed to the violence, and they also might make gripes against saying this sort of thing happens primarily to African Americans. I've seen other comments from white people online, but these comments are almost entirely non-applicable to the question of whether or not there's a real problem or what sort of solutions we should put in place. Instead, they seem to distract from that underlying problem. Now, let's say you're a conservative and you say, okay, we should do something about this underlying problem, but I really don't like these protests. My primary goal here is to stop the protests, right? One guy died, so many people die a year from police violence, but more people are going to die if these riots continue than will die in a year from police violence. Maybe that's your stance, something like that. Do you really think that the sort of rhetoric you're using now, condemning the riots but talking barely at all about what the solutions are to the reason for the riots, is going to win you any friends on the left, right? If your goal is to stop the riots, it seems like what you would want to do is say, look, I hear your grievance. This is very serious. Let's do something about it. Because then you take away the impetus for the riots in the first place and the power away from those folks. That's how you accomplish what your ostensible goal is, if your goal is to actually decrease the violence and stop the riots. Now you might say, well, we need to have law and order, Donald Trump is right, let's send in the National Guard and the military. Right? Well, if your goal is to decrease the total loss of life from riots and protests, this seems like a very bad idea, sending in a military force. It seems like you're going to kill more people, not fewer in this way. And even if I'm wrong about that, even if this just scares everybody and they all go home in this particular case, you make future riots significantly more likely. You make people feel disenfranchised because, hey, they sent the military after us folks. We're hated, we're second-class citizens, all of this. You play into the sort of, I guess, victim mentality, you might call it, that you believe leads to these things in the first place. The solution for you to stop future protests should be to stop this sort of thing from happening again. And if there are just easy solutions we can take to cause that to happen, wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't it be better to advocate for those things now, have Donald Trump score some points with leftists who now will be willing to vote for him because he actually took their plight seriously and did something? Wouldn't it be worth doing that as opposed to isolating them further cutting yourselves off from them and making it harder for you to have a dialogue going forward? It just doesn't seem like it coheres with your goal at all. All right, that's my bone to nitpick with you. Left-wing folks, I have a bone to nitpick with you as well. Protests are good. You should continue defending people's right to peacefully protest. However, I've seen a lot of people on the left online not just defend the protests, but also defend the violence that some protesters have done against people's private businesses and institutions. I've seen arguments along the lines of, hey, we're leftists. We don't believe in capitalism. We believe that there is a proletariat, a masses that have the actual right to the resources that are in places like Target and in places like Walmart. And the fat, greedy capitalists who own Target and Walmart, well, they're not justified in owning those resources. So we're not actually doing anything unjust by breaking into Target or Walmart. All right, fine. If that's the stance you want to take, great, wonderful. Believe that. Props to you. We can argue about that later. If you're making that argument now, that the violence is justified on the basis of the fact that there's no rightful property claim on the behalf of the people who own these businesses in the first place, you are distracting from the issue you're trying to solve. And you make it a lot easier for people on the right to say, oh, look at these crazy Antifa George Soros types who really don't have anything to do with what most people in the United States believe, because, hey, that's not what most people in the United States believe at all. And that's not really why these protests are happening. And that's not even really why the riots, or the looting and riots are happening. Looting and riots are happening because members of the protests who are fed up and upset and see an opportunity to get something for free, they took it, right? Maybe some of them are acting out of like this weird ideological fervor. And this isn't the only argument I've seen, but I've seen a lot of people on the left, instead of doing what I think is the obvious thing and saying what I said a minute ago to conservatives, yeah, riots are bad, but do you want to stop the riots? Because it seems like the practical thing to do to stop the riots is fix the underlying issue. Instead of doing that, and instead of saying what the sensible thing would be to say, I've seen a lot of people on the left just straight out defending the same sort of violence on the part of the protesters as they would on the part of the police. Now, granted, protesters are doing it a lot less than the police, but they're still doing it sometimes. So, if conservatives point that out, suck it up. Say, yeah, they did it. And maybe in your heart of hearts you think maybe they were justified to do it. But it seems like the same exact sort of strange strategic error that the conservatives are making. It's almost as if everyone in this country right now isn't actually concerned with fixing problems, but instead they're concerned with scoring points and dunking on the other side. Oh wait, it's not as if that's the case, that just is the case, objectively speaking right now. So let's not do that. Instead, let's talk about the sorts of steps we can take to actually solve underlying issues and underlying problems. All right? What are these real sorts of solutions that conservatives and liberals both should be able to get behind? Well, first, let's try to get rid of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a Supreme Court doctrine that basically says, hey, if you're going to sue a police department for violating your civil rights, you better hope to high heaven that there's a case that's exactly identical to yours, that has all the same facts of the matter lining up with yours, so that the court can determine that they actually did violate what was previously determined to be a constitutional right. Because right now, courts throw these sorts of cases where people's rights were very clearly violated out all the time on the basis of the fact that, well, the facts of the matter are slightly different. There's been a recent bill suggested in Congress by Justin Amash to get rid of privileged immunity, and the Supreme Court is hopefully going to hear other cases in the very near future where they can help to overturn this. All right, privileged immunity, getting rid of that, that's one thing. What's another thing? Well, we can make it harder for police officers who are fired because of misconduct, which is very hard to do, by the way. Police unions are very powerful and very strong, and there's a very, very high burden of proof to ever get a police officer fired. But when they do get fired, all too often they end up getting hired by different police departments in different cities and nearby cities because, well, there's nothing stopping that from happening. And because very often the police union and their former bosses will help them get a job in an entirely new precinct, despite the fact that they were fired because they weren't very good at their job or because there were complaints against them. So let's try to put in place laws and rules on the state level that'll stop that from happening. That's, in my opinion, a pretty good solution. Another solution, this one might seem a bit more radical to some of you, but I think it's pretty good, particularly to stop things like this. Let's get rid of crimes that are specifically crimes against hurting police officers. Now, let's keep crimes against assault, so that if you assault a police officer, you can be found guilty of assault. But let's not create a special second category of crime for assaulting a police officer. You committed assault, that's all you did. You didn't do anything particularly special, they're just people. A lot of people filmed George Floyd being murdered. If that had been anybody other than a police officer, they surely would have tackled him off of George Floyd and saved George Floyd's life. They didn't, because we have this strange mysticism that we ascribe to police officers, where they get to kill people in front of us and we'll deal with it later. That should not be the case. If you see something like this happening, you should feel as though it is entirely within your rights to get involved and put a stop to it. Now, the police officer might shoot you, and so that might give you a good reason not to do that, but that's something that needs to be taken care of too, and the law needs to be changed so that if those people had done this to George Floyd, and they had been able to establish, look, he was assaulting this person could have died, he wasn't following proper police protocol, they should have been entirely able to do that, and it should have been good. And that should have been the end of it. That should have been the entire thing. Other solutions. Special prosecutors. Right now, prosecutors work very, very, very closely with police departments. And when that happens, you can't just go around filing charges against police officers, because then the police don't work with you well. So that's why it almost never happens, even when police very clearly commit a crime. They're almost never charged with it by prosecutors. So, what's the solution? Well, you put in place a special prosecutor specifically to go after crimes that are committed by police officers. Now, you don't want them to be overly litigious, and so there might be a specific sort of system you want to put in place. But you really don't want them being prosecuted by the same prosecutorial team that they work with on a daily basis. There are friendships there, it seems like a conflict of interest, and it also just makes it harder for prosecutors to work with police officers in general if they ever do have to do that sort of a thing. And I could keep going on. In fact, I have a list of further solutions, and some of them are more radical, some of them are even more common sense. But the point is, these are the things we should be talking about right now. And if we were all talking about these things, conservatives, hey, you wouldn't have to worry about the riots so much. And hey, liberals, if you talked about these solutions more instead of going out of your way to defend property damage, well, maybe conservatives wouldn't have as much of a leg to stand on when they complain about it. Because you could just point out, look, we all disagree with that. Let's talk about the issues. Let's talk about what we can do to stop this from happening in the future. Just some thoughts. Let's just all try to understand where each other are coming from and have empathy for each other's